Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. There's a theory of justice called restorative justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused or revealed by criminal behavior, rather than only punishing offenders for violating laws against the state. I've asked Mika Dashman, a public interest lawyer and the founder of Restorative Justice Initiative in New York City, to tell us more about it. And she's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
So can we get a brief outline of what restorative justice is?
So the way that I like to define it is restorative justice is a non-punitive response to crime or conflict. And it focuses on repairing harm and fostering wrongdoer accountability.
So let's go the next step.
Okay.
What's the process?
So restorative justice, you may also sometimes hear me use the term restorative practices. These are broad umbrella terms, and they encompass a whole range of different practices that can be applied in different settings. So I can tell you some of the practices. We can go through some of them. It would take a long time to go through a whole laundry list. But so one of the ones that is well known that's used in the criminal justice system here in the United States is victim-offender dialogue or victim-offender mediation, which involves, just like it sounds, it involves bringing together a victim of a crime and a perpetrator, always at the behest of the victim, for some kind of face-to-face dialogue that gives the harmed party the opportunity to ask the perpetrator questions related to their own personal lives and the incident, the crime at issue. A lot of times victims have questions that only a perpetrator can answer. And in the criminal justice, the typical criminal justice system process, victim and offender are kept apart and don't have an opportunity to have any direct contact. So this allows for that in situations where that's something that the victim wants and needs for their own healing process.
And the perpetrator doesn't necessarily have to participate if they don't want to, or do they?
In victim-offender dialogue or mediation processes, they do participate.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
And where is it? We don't do that here, though, do we, with our criminal justice system in New York?
Nobody is currently doing that exactly in New York. There is a program through the New York Peace Institute, which is a criminal court mediation program that's a little bit of a hybrid between victim-offender mediation and some other mediation processes. So that's the closest thing that I'm aware of to victim-offender dialogue. So in that program, they receive referrals from the Kings County District Attorney's Office, usually of cases where the parties have an ongoing relationship. So they may be family members or neighbors or coworkers. And so what the courts have observed is that in those kinds of situations where there's an ongoing relationship, there's usually a lot more there than what meets the eye in the, as far as the facts of the criminal case at issue are concerned. And so it can be very useful for people to sit down together and talk about the underlying issues and see if they can resolve things themselves without going through a criminal adjudication process.
So it's before the process starts and before sentencing, if there is ever anything like that?
It's sort of in the middle. So the cases, there's already a criminal court case that's been opened, and the referrals are made to mediation by the district attorney with the consent of the defense counsel and of the parties. So the parties have to be willing to participate. That's a big part of restorative processes. They really have to be voluntary. If they become in any way coercive, then they're really not restorative.
There was a stunning story in the New York Times months ago about a family, both families of the victim and the perpetrator, where the young man who had a relationship, they were a loving couple for years, right? And the young man shot her. And the parents decided, the two sets of parents decided they wanted this because the victim's parents had been so fond of the young man.
Yeah.
But they had to fight to get it, right? They had to bring in a lawyer to try to convince the prosecutor to allow that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that was certainly the first time, and I think the only time that type of process has occurred in a capital murder case. Certainly in Florida, that is very unusual. I was actually at a conference recently where I had an opportunity to hear the Grossmare family speak, the husband and wife whose daughter was killed in that case. That was profiled in the New York Times, and they are really, really amazing people.
They are, yeah.
So, you know, it does go to show that if a victim, no matter how severe the case, if a victim really, really wants this, really wants to take an alternative approach,
and understand,
and they really advocate for it strongly, it can happen. It can happen, but it really does need to be initiated by the victim. And in many jurisdictions where there is no established restorative programming and no infrastructure for it, you know, victims will need to go out and you know, sort of do their own research and find a practitioner to bring in from somewhere else, like they did in that case.
And it requires then such an innate empathetic outlook on life, doesn't it? I mean, you have to be a very special person to take that action to go along with it. I don't know.
Yeah.
You could be convinced of it. What bothers me is when you see a case in court and after the verdict, and then the victims' families or victims can get up and talk. The anger that is so bottled up, and that's their only way of showing it or doing anything, has always seemed to me not to be the most desirable process. How would we, do you agree with me? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think, you know, I certainly cannot speak for victims, and everybody has their own response to hurtful things that happen to them. And I think that, you know, anger and vindictiveness is certainly a common response and maybe even a natural response. But what I have heard from many people is that somewhere along the line, in order to really truly heal from an incident of harm and to move on with your life, it becomes necessary for many individuals to have some kind of experience of forgiveness or reconciliation with the person who harmed them. So I believe that more people would actually want that or ask for that than we may be aware of. Because, you know, the people who end up reporting crimes and end up going to trial, you know, testifying as witnesses at a criminal trial, may be more likely to be people who are comfortable within the retributive justice framework. And so I suspect that there are other people out there who are not comfortable and are actually would actually like something different, would like to have a different process available, who may not know that such a thing exists or may not know how to ask for it or what to ask for, who perhaps you know, don't report a crime to begin with, or they do report it, but then they decide they opt not to testify against the defendant. So the people, the victims that we see giving victim impact statements in criminal court are not necessarily representative of all crime victims.
It's interesting, yeah. Retributive justice, explain that to us, because you use that term.
Well, that's my shorthand for the dominant model of criminal justice in this country. It's a punitive, retributive model as opposed to a restorative model.
I was fascinated also at the end of the Pat's case the last couple of weeks ago. They waited to announce the verdict until the father of Etan came. Now, that was not really, I don't know, how does that fit into your restorative justice?
Well, I can't really speak to what happened in that case in particular. I mean, I understand from the news reporting that the parents were felt very strongly that they wanted a conviction, and that the defendant in that case, who was prosecuted, was
all I'm talking about really though is the machinery around it and how we do cater. That's not the word, and I've been a victim several times to crimes that are not ever been life-threatening or anything like that. But I'm just talking about how so much of our justice system is based on retribution and revenge and stuff. And it's not only with people, it's just the system.
I think that's true, but I would also say that our system generally is defendant-focused and not victim-centered. So the whole process kind of revolves around the defendant, which is not to say that it provides for justice necessarily, or that it's fair or impartial with regard to the defendant, but very often the needs and desires of individual victims are not addressed in the existing system.
So this is definitely a victim-oriented process?
It is generally seen that way. It, again, because restorative justice is such a broad term, it depends somewhat on the process. Okay, so that there are programs, for example, that work with people who are incarcerated while they're incarcerated, and also as they are completing their transition out of prison. And those programs don't necessarily have a victim component. So some of those programs will use what they call a proxy victim or surrogate victim, where somebody who has been the victim of a crime, who has decided that they want to speak to people who are serving time for committing similar crimes, to help them develop empathy for their victims, may go into a correctional facility and speak with and tell their story to
See, now
people
I've
serving
taken
time.
it as an advocate for prison reform. I can see in my mind a role in parole hearings, because I think they tend to be very ungenerous often and vengeful. And now, in a process that I'm very involved in, trying to get clemencies for people, how useful it would be. I mean, I can use Judy Clark, who's my friend, the defendant, who's been in prison for 34 years on a a felony murder charge, 3, I guess, because she was at part of a group that killed other people, although she didn't do it. She's been in prison for 34 years. Her sentence is 75 years to life. She has been such a successful model of rehabilitation in a prison. But she's not allowed to really talk to victims' families. It's very hard. She sent an open letter to the newspaper. How useful it would be, because to give her clemency means the governor then has to go against the DA, the state police, the victims' families. And if they all knew what she was now, it would be so much easier. So I hope we'll work on that.
Yeah,
I'm going to stay after you to do that.
There are many, many aspects of our current criminal justice system that could use reform, and I would even argue complete transformation. Restorative justice, I think, is a piece of that. And I think that there are a number of different ways where it can be applied at different junctures within the criminal justice process.
But I want to talk about other ways it can be applied not in the criminal justice system. So let's talk about that.
So restorative justice has really broader implications and applications beyond the criminal justice system, which is one of the things that I find so exciting about it, because it really requires you to embrace a fundamentally different paradigm in terms of how we think about our relationships with each other and how we think about harm when it occurs, whether or not that harm occurs, it rises to the level of a criminal act. Okay, so one of the ways in which restorative justice is gaining popularity and traction throughout the country these days is as an alternative to punitive discipline in schools. So, as you know, there has been increased awareness about the school-to-prison pipeline that exists in this country, and many school districts, particularly urban school districts, have come under pressure to do away with zero-tolerance disciplinary policies that have disproportionate minority impact in terms of who gets expelled from school, and there is a very direct correlation between high school dropouts. When you have not graduated from high school, your chances of ending up incarcerated increase greatly. So one of the things that districts throughout the country have done in place of zero-tolerance discipline is to begin to implement restorative justice programs, and that can look a lot of different ways. There are peer mediation programs and youth courts and things like that going on. So in some schools, and my understanding is in the schools where restorative practices have been most successfully adopted, they take a very holistic approach, and basically the school becomes a restorative school. It changes the whole culture of the school, and it involves all the young people at the school and staff and teachers and administration. So it's not just a process that you use when there's an incident that then becomes associated by the students with getting in trouble, right? So it becomes it just becomes a part of life at the school and a part of community building. So a lot of schools use circles, peacemaking circles, which is a model that is based on traditions in many indigenous cultures, where a talking stick is used to regulate the flow of conversation and to make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard. And many schools will use these circles on a daily basis in classrooms as a way of building relationships between young people and changing the way that they interact with each other, as opposed to just using a circle model when there is a disciplinary infraction.
So it sounds to me like a consciousness-raising group or even drug treatment groups and people where you see people talking and developing and understanding each other better. Is it the same kind of thing? Similar, I mean?
I think there's probably some overlap to those models. Restorative practices really are about creating space where people can actually see each other as fully human and be seen and be fully heard. So we all need space to tell our stories. and restorative practices allow that to happen.
And that then increases the understanding of the people who are hearing it.
It increases, absolutely.
Tolerance.
It increases empathy and tolerance. The more people are, real with each other and vulnerable with each other, the more of a deep bond they will form, and the stronger the community. So restorative justice can be used to build community, and that applies in schools as well as neighborhood-based community organizations, and then throughout the criminal justice system.
So how did this whole concept grab you, grip you? Where did you start to get interested in it?
Well, I had worked, before I went to law school, I worked as a criminal defense investigator at a public defender agency in the South Bronx. And for me, that was a real eye-opening experience. And it left me feeling, it left me understanding in a different way how fundamentally differently the criminal justice system impacts poor, low-income communities of color than other communities, even within New York City, where we're very densely populated. The experience of policing and of criminal justice is vastly different depending on what neighborhood you live in and the color of your skin and your economic status. So I saw that up close, and I felt it left me feeling not very hopeful about the existing system. It seemed to me that it wasn't really addressing anybody's needs. So while I admired the public defenders who I worked for, who worked very hard and fought very hard for their clients, the ultimate goal was still to keep the client out of jail, or to get the minimal penalty for the crime. But in some cases, that individual, the client, had actually really harmed somebody. And so there was no mechanism for the victim to have a voice in that process, or for that harm to actually be addressed, or for the defendant to really take responsibility for what they had done. And make amends. Do you find that defendants don't totally understand the harm they've caused? I don't know whether people understand it or not. I think that the system creates an incentive for not dwelling on it or denying it. That is what you do.
You automatically go in and say not guilty.
Yes, that is what you are advised to do by your lawyer. And so what actually occurred and the harm that actually may have taken place is not something that you're encouraged to think a whole lot about, certainly not to talk about. And I think that in this country, this is sort of going back to your question about what do I mean by retributive justice. I think that we have this false perception that that when we punish people, that when we put people in prison, that action creates accountability, but it really doesn't. And I have seen videos of groups with people who are serving long sentences for violent crime, And when a proxy victim, as I mentioned earlier, comes in and speaks to them about, about how they were victimized, how they were hurt by some kind of criminal act, that is often the first time that defendant really thinks about their victim as fully human and thinks about the broader implications of their action, that, this didn't just harm an individual person, that this actually had an impact on a whole family and sometimes a whole community.
So we're almost to the end of the program.
Okay.
Tell us about the initiative and what people can do.
So the Restorative Justice Initiative is a citywide cross-sector advocacy organization promoting restorative justice and restorative practices. So as you have observed, there is not a whole lot happening here in New York City with regard to restorative justice and restorative practices. There is a movement afoot to adopt restorative practices more broadly in the school system, which is very exciting. And there are groups such as Teachers Unite who are working on that. But the idea of the initiative is actually just to raise awareness and understanding of restorative justice, and to let people know that it's out there and the broad range of applications and what's happening in other states and cities, because we don't need to reinvent the wheel here in New York. There are really interesting models happening all around the country, and in other countries as well, that can be adapted here in New York City. And I really believe that now is the moment.
That's so you've got a website, restorativjustice.NYC.
NYC. It's an NYC
that people
domain.
can go to find more information.
Yeah.
That people can go to talk to you,
Sure.
to find out if they have suggestion where they could use this, or if they have suggestion.
Yes.
All that information.
So there is a contact form, and people are welcome to contact me with any questions. There's also a resources page. So if you want to learn more about restorative justice, what I've done is I've collected a whole list of recommended readings, books, and articles. I have a bunch of videos on there, news articles, and various resources for people on different topics. There's also information about where you can get more training if you'd like to be trained as a restorative practitioner.
So we've come to the end. I'm so sorry because it's so interesting, but thank you very much,
You're
Mika.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, a pleasure.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.